Thank you. Our next talk is going to be by David Carlson. Dave has been a data scientist for over 14 years. He actually started up old school. He was an actual analyst, and now over the time, he's worked on a bunch of different tools, and now he works mainly on a lot on risk insights. He's going to talk about enabling R and Python, interactive R and Python on Hadoop. Okay, thank you.
So this is going to be, also about, like the prior discussion was like, some of the issues with the enterprise. This is going to be a very non-technical, technical discussion. Like there will not be any discussion of like Kafka, Spark, that would be more interesting. This is more some of the, softer issues that you might have when trying to adopt open source in the enterprise. So really just three main general points that we're going to kind of go over. To the extent anyone has any question, just speak up. But maybe you have the belief, or hopefully you don't. If you're in an enterprise that's adopted open source, hopefully some of this rings true. If you're in an enterprise setting, but you've not adopted open source, hopefully this is interesting. And if neither of those apply, this will be short. So at least you'll have that. So one thing that you might hear, one reason people might go to open source platforms is a cost savings. If cost savings is your primary goal, that's bad. That's really, really bad because you will have many, many headaches. If anything, it's more of a cost transfer. So to the extent that you might had more proprietary stacks from vendors that might have a lot of S's in it, and some P's and some A's. So you're going to reduce your license costs, but it is going to be a paradigm shift. Obviously, a lot of you probably know that since you're here, is that the way that you have to think about the way that you need to contribute back to potentially to the open source community, and also the issues that, depending on where your issue is, like you might not necessarily always have a vendor to fall back on to troubleshoot. Sometimes you are going to have to do that yourself. Another thing is in an enterprise setting is you will have security integration issues. There's a four-letter word called Kerberos that some of you may or may not have had to deal with. And there's minimal to no documentation on certain aspects of integrating security properly, because there's going to be governance around, especially if you're in like a insurance financial situation. So I'm assuming our Capital One colleagues probably have similar issues at times of just being able to trace and track where your data is going and who has access to it. Another thing about going to an open source stack is that you're probably going to create a different operation model need that you might have not had in the past. You're going to probably need more and tighter integration between your engineering team and your analytics team. Historically, you might have only implement everything in Java. You might want to try to implement directly in R and Python. I've never met an R production engineer. If anyone has, let me know afterwards. Python engineers, definitely, but it is going to be a transformational change. So to the extent you're in an enterprise environment, to those that you have not, if you do not know what a project manager is, what a BA is, I envy you to some extent. And then another thing about the open source stack, so you have Spark, you have Hadoop, but not all of your analytics problems, especially when you get down to your actual training sets, are not really Hadoop size. They're not really distributed computing problems. Most of the time, I start off with potentially terabytes of data, but your actual final training set might be a couple gigs. And this day and age, where you can have hundreds, if not a terabyte of RAM on a single machine, you don't always need a one-size-fit-all. Like this is not, I have a hammer, everything's a nail. This is a much more complicated problem space than maybe historically what you had to deal with. Another issue you're going to have when they're trying to adopt open source solutions is if you had proprietary stacks prior, you might have had like annual refreshes, and you could definitely plan around that. Now, those of you that do work with Spark, if you have a version of Spark that's like a year old, you're probably going nuts on like, this is so old, when if you were using like, let's say SPSS or something like that, there might be like one or two new features that are introduced. So you need to make sure that you give your data scientists, your analysts, the flexibility of being able to explore and possibly even be able to contribute to some of the open source libraries. But you also need to do it in a very kind of regimented way. Like you need to, like without getting into all the checks, but you're going to have, like what licenses do you accept? Do you accept, MIT? What about Apache 2? It's not just because I found it on GitHub does not mean that I can actually go and productionalize this library and this code. So if this is new to you, and you need to make sure that you're going through the proper gates, and this may be something. If you're in a large enough corporation, you have a formal legal department. You have various areas that can kind of assist you with a lot of these issues. But it is something that you need to be aware of, and it's not just the luxury that you have at home of just being able to, I'm just going to spin up an AWS instance. You don't necessarily have that, that freedom necessary in an enterprise setting, and for good reason. So, like a couple recommendations is in enterprise environments. Like once you've determined like what can we use for production, what can we not use for production. Having internally like central repositories, like of which I'm sure many of you have heard of, like Minikran for R and Miniconda for Python or R these days, and have like scheduled updates to production. So whether that be quarterly, whether that be monthly, but not just any time anyone wants to productionalize additional libraries or packages into your overall repository, because otherwise it's death by 1,000 cuts if you are in a analytical department of 50, 60, 100 people. So another issue, like I go home, I'm gonna sit there and see if I can, can I beat Mark Landry or Arno on this month's Calca competition. I can just use the cloud. I can spin things up very quickly, but there's things I don't need to worry about at home that I do in the enterprise. In the enterprise, I generally am not working on a project by myself, and to the extent that you might have come from like a coding background and you understand what source control is, the value of source control, this isn't a big issue. But to the extent that maybe you came from more a math or stats background, and you might not have dealt with like collaboration tools, you need to make sure that you set up, make these types of tools available for your team, and encourage their use. Because this day and age, more and more, like your coworkers might not be co-located with you. They might be on the other side of the U.S., other side of the world, and having these collaboration tools is critical. Another thing that definitely can hurt you in a larger group setting is when you are dealing with R. If people are just working locally with R, however many computers you have that are installed, that's probably how many different instances and setups of R that you have. So trying to make sure that you can work together effectively and have the same libraries, the same versions of them, is kind of going back to that prior thing of making sure, to the extent possible, you have central, repository set up of your valid libraries. Another, aspect is, so I actually think this is a fairly useful vehicle, a monster truck with DeLorean. But sometimes you might over-engineer solutions, and you don't necessarily always. You might not have something that could be moved into a production environment. So just because you found it on GitHub, it's the latest cutting-edge solution, it might not be what the end user was looking for. And to the extent that you can't get acceptance, to the extent that you can't get it implemented in production, because there might be like an application layer that you have to integrate with. There might be a lot of other workflow issues, because like sometimes it might actually be not something that's just system-generated data. It might be something where actually you have to be hand-entered. So getting it, actually figuring out where it fits into your workflow, because to the extent your models are not productionalized, they are useless. They have no value in a business setting. So hopefully that, any questions, or is this, are people in an enterprise setting? Is this kind of what you see? Is this not what you see? For those that are in small shops and they don't have the overhead and the kind of the speed to production, the additional teams of having a formal engineering team, having a formal testing team. So.
Has there been any data governance issues at the same time of trying to use these tools on data that may have problems in it inherently?
Yes, so a couple issues that you might have, especially in older enterprise organizations, is you might have restrictions around like where's the data located? Like is it on premise? Is it off premise? Who can have access? Because you might have the restrictions of, well, you can only have access to the data that you need specifically to do your job, and in our profession, like we might have a different interpretation of that than someone in a data governance role, because, well, all data is relevant until you look at it, examine it, and determine it otherwise, right? That's not necessarily always the approach that your data governance or just your governance function at your company might have. But that definitely is an issue that also has to be overcome, of which there's ways of dealing with that, right? It's like, so to the extent that you can still have the checks and balances, but still make sure that they're done in an effective manner, right? So you can have, like to the extent that you might have to do like privacy training for your analytics team of like, what do I do with the data? What can I do with the data? Just because I have command line access and I can and FTP things down doesn't mean that you should, right? Because I mean, to the extent, I mean, we'll see if my Xer colleagues will come up and bum rush me here on the stage. But to the extent that you want to do malicious things with data at your company for you to effectively do your job, there is some level of professionalism that probably needs to exist in enterprise setting. So I don't see my manager bum rushing me right now, so I think that's okay. So. Yep. So.
Yeah. Okay, David. I have one over here. So I manage open source in a large organization, and one of the things that I experience is surely someone else has already done this, and or you should be able to find that online. Those are always great moments for me. And then another thing that we are
I guess just a question for you. Do you always find that, though, with the open source?
No, I'm talking about some of the challenges you have with open source and managing open source. We are always, more often than not, authors of our own problems. No one else has experienced the same thing. Took over an hour-long session with a vendor to solve a problem. They're like, really? There's no white paper on it? I'm like, we are trailblazing here.
Yep.
And I feel that. And then the second part is, then at what point do you go back to some sort of sponsor for your open source? And I'm not talking like you're a CEO or a CFO, but sponsor like someone like H2O. They offer it free for you to work with at home, but at what point do you start becoming a partner, a vended partner with them?
Having vendor partners, especially since a lot of the open source platforms like R, Python, like the expertise in your underlying kernels might be with your analytics team, not necessarily with your IT, right? So these high-level languages are generally would never have been the first choice for like a service layer. Like probably would have been Java, or if it's a .NET shop like C# or something of that nature. So that is a challenge. All right, so running out of time, so I'll try to make this quick. Yes, find vendor partners. They can be invaluable. And where you might have had one vendor that would have supported the entire full stack, now your IDE might be one vendor, your kernel might be another, the libraries you're using is another. So making sure that you have good communication and collaboration across those vendors also is very important. So, all right, so thank you very much. And I will.
We'll take a quick 10-minute break and before we get back to our next session. Thank you.